I'd like to first, welcome everybody for joining us today. Some of you have joined us this morning with Rabbi Silver's class to kick off our LO program for this year. And today we're lucky enough to have Rabbi Dr. Yosef Bronstein for our second class in the series, in the 9 different series that we're offering this year. Rabbi Dr. Yosef Bronstein, he received the rabbinical ordination from RIETS and a PhD in Talmudic Studies from the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies with a focus on Midrash Halacha. And he currently teaches Jewish philosophy and halacha at Mechalet Nevaser Yerushalayim, or colloquially, whatever, regularly known as MMY, and online for Yeshiva University's Isaac Breyers College, or IBC. He has 2 books, hopefully coming out soon, Engaging the Essence, the Philosophy of the Lubavitcher Rebbe from Maggid Books, and Rishimot Shiurim Shel Moran Harav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik and Mesachet Kiddushin. So we're very, very lucky to have you. Thank you so much, Dr. Bronstein, for joining us today. And without further ado, please take it away.
Thank you, Yudis, and thank you everybody else for joining us. And before I start, this is my first formal shiur at Drisha, my first formal presentation. So I just want to mention, I'm not sure to whom, to Yudis, to the cloud, how lucky I am, how privileged I feel to be able to join the program at Drisha. I've emailed Rabbi Silver this morning that I've been a long admirer of Drisha from afar. I've certainly taken part in some of their online programs. But I've seen the impact on myself and on some of my peers and my social group. But it's my first formal time on this end of the screen. So I just wanted to mention how privileged I feel, and a big thank you to Rabbi Silver, to Yehudis, to Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Zuckier for bringing me on. So God willing, over the course of the next 4 Sundays, we're going to be discussing the emotions of tshuva, with a focus on 3 20th century figures, Rav Kook, Rav Soloveitchik, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So in this class, though, we're not going to be talking about them per se. We're going to be doing almost a background to see how innovative and how interesting and what they did with the earlier sources. We're going to be looking at a traditional medieval approach to the concept of tshuva. So what we're going to do today is we're going to divide the presentation into 4 parts. The first part is going to be a general introduction to the series. Then we're going to describe the emotions of tshuva from the perspective of the major Rishonim, major medieval commentators, focusing on a little bit of Rambam, but mostly Rabbeinu Yonah, the author of Shari Tshuva, The Gates of Repentance, which is one of the primary books that people study during the month of Elul. Then we're going to look at some modern expressions of this approach. We're going to look at people in the 19th and 20th centuries and even 21st centuries that just take these things literally and apply them to their lives. And we're going to see almost in real life, in real experiential terms, what that means for their Elul, what that means for their Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And then we're going to discuss a little bit at the end, but this is a much broader topic, about how this approach relates to some of our modern sensibilities of the concepts of happiness, joy, sadness, psychological health, mental health, and things of that sort. And we'll get a little bit of a sense as to why certain 20th century figures moved away from this traditional approach. Good. So that is going to be a basic background. I'm going to stop at various points to take questions. If there are any questions or comments are also totally fine. If you have a question, you have a comment, feel free to write it in the chat, and I will try to address it at the appropriate time. Also, the source sheet is linked on the chat. So if you follow, I'm not going to share my own screen because then it's hard to see other people. But if you want to follow along inside, feel free to download the source sheet at the link. So what are we focusing on? So most of the Jewish literature about tshuva focuses on the halachos of tshuva. Tshuva is a mitzvah, according to most Rishonim. It is a commandment, one of the 613 commandments, according to most commentators. And therefore, like every other halakha, it has details, it has steps, it has a process. And what the Rambam, Rabbeinu Yonah, the Meiri, when he wrote his book on tshuva, but mostly what they're trying to figure out is what are the technical steps that one has to do to fulfill this mitzvah of tshuva and attain atonement. We are not going to be focusing on the technical steps of tshuva. we are going to be focusing on the emotional associations, the emotional journey that's supposed to accompany this process, these technical steps. It's almost going to be like a study in phenomenology. Phenomenology was a branch of philosophy in the early 20th century, where instead of discussing the essence of something, whatever it is, they took in sort of a perspective of a human being experiencing that item or experiencing that experience and tried to describe it from the inside out. So we're not going to be describing tshuva, the mechanics, how it works, metaphysically, how does tshuva work, what are the steps to tshuva. We're going to be discussing that a little bit, because you need that for the framework. We're going to be discussing phenomenologically, how does one experience this process, how does one experience tshuva. And as a starting point for our entire discussion, I think it's extremely important to read through the first source on the source sheet, which is an essay, which is an excerpt of an essay from Rabbi Soloveitchik. There are certain, when Rabbi Soloveitchik passed away in the early 90s, apparently he left behind closets or desks filled with manuscripts that were yet unpublished. It took the family several law cases, several lawsuits and several disputes to find the right people to publish them. But now currently, Korah and Maggid Press is in the process of publishing a good number of these unpublished manuscripts. So 3 years ago, in 2017, there was a book called Halachic Morality that came out from unpublished essays of Rav Soloveitchik. And Rav Soloveitchik there has an essay entitled Religious Styles. And I think for me, this was an extremely important essay, because it sort of frames what we're going to be doing now, and a lot of what I like to do when I try to study Jewish philosophy myself. So let's read it together. It's a long excerpt where we'll highlight some of the key lines, and people can read more on their own if they want to. So Rabbi Soloveitchik writes as follows. He says, we have in Torah a derech Hashem and a derech HaChayim. What does that mean? A way of God and a way of life. I want to introduce here another term. Besides possessing derech HaChayim, a Torah way of life, we also have a Torah style of living. We call it a signon HaChayim. So you have the path of Torah, which we're going to see for Rabbi Soloveitchik is very narrow. Halacha has very clear boundaries. He wasn't a major pluralist when it comes to halacha. There is one approach to halacha. Halacha is like a form of science, but there are many signon hachayim. There are many styles of life. There are many ways of doing it, many ways of experiencing it. So let's read it in his own words. The difference between the two is obvious. The way of a religious life is universal. Everyone travels along the same path. Again, this is debatable. This is Rav Soloveitchik's conception of halacha. No highway is paved for just one individual and denied to all others. Skip down to after the ellipsis, skip down a line and a half. However, two people may travel on the same highway in the same direction, following the same signs, yet each may have individual style of movement. One moves gracefully with rhythm to his movements, while the other moves clumsily, awkwardly, always out of step with his co-travelers. You could walk down the highway in different paths. The next paragraph, which we're not going to read inside, Rav Soloveitchik describes how you could have two people going through the same rituals at the night of the Seder. One of them is experiencing ecstasy, joy, singing, dancing, bringing the family into it, running around the table. And another person, serene, solemn, serious. They're both doing the same rituals. They're both reading the same text, but they have two different religious styles. Let's read the last line of this paragraph that's underlined. There was one way of Jewish life, but there are a variety of styles of how to experience God while performing one's duty. That they should do, this refers to going beyond the letter of the law. Each person in his own manner or style. So this is going to be the basic framework they're going to be working within. All the people we're going to be discussing are going to be discussing the same technical process, but there's going to be a different flavor. Why do different people have different flavors? So Rav Soloveitchik in this essay says, because each person is an individual. Another major theme in Rav Soloveitchik's thought. Each person is unique. Each person has their own personality style, their own thought processes, et cetera, and therefore each one experiences God differently. What we're going to be arguing, and this is something Rav Soloveitchik is not so comfortable saying, as we'll discuss next week, is that also the culture you're living within, the time period you're living within, is going to determine, partially at least, your religious style. If you're living in the 1100s and 1200s and 1300s in Egypt or Spain, you're very likely to have one religious style. If you're living in 20th century America, 21st century America, the cultural baggage you have, for better or for worse, when you approach Jewish texts and when you approach Jewish rituals, very well might change or modify for you the way you experience these things. And that's why we're going to be arguing that the 20th century was a little bit of a turning point in terms of how tshuva could or should be experienced. And therefore you have this wide gamut. Rav Soloveitchik, Rav Kook, Lubavitcher Rebbe, discussing each one individually, where they're coming from, what they kept, what they changed, and why they did that. But that's going to be the common denominator is that they all grew up in like Eastern European rabbinic homes. They all created very strong Torah communities on different shores. Rav Soloveitchik, Lubavitcher Rebbe in New York, Rav Kook in Israel. They kept a certain flavor of that Eastern European Jewish life of the Alterheim, but they very consciously did not create carbon copies. And that's what we're going to be focusing on, how that manifests itself when it comes to the experience of tshuva. Even before we get to just talking about, before we even get to talking about the traditional approach to tshuva, I wanted to just give you two very short clips, both from 2017, from 2 years ago, to see what range we could be talking about in terms of how tshuva could be experienced. This will take around 4 minutes. So I'm going to share my screen to show you two different YouTube clips. The first one, one second. The first one is this is Rav Nagar. Rav Nagar is an Israeli. He's from Timani descent. He runs an organization called Or L'Noar, which is a kiruv organization. As you can see, he skews Haredi, but he has a lot of very interesting views, a lot of very interesting things to say on all different topics. I was just recently reading something from his question answer forum, which he has online, and there was a woman that asked him if it's mutter for her, if it's permissible for her to become a tayaset, to become a pilot in an Israeli army. A lot of Haredi rabbis would say, no, it's prohibited on a variety of grounds. He said, no, you have to be careful of X, Y, and Z, but if you feel like this is your job, you're drawn towards this, there's a way to do it in a way that is going to sanctify God's name. So it's sort of an out-of-the-box Haredi. This is a speech he gave about Elul. I'm going to play you a minute. The English translation is on the sheet under source number 2. Get the background, get the tone, and catch the language as well.
מצמר שאמא שלו קנתה לו ושמה לו בחדר, הוא לא מבין מה זה. אדם שמחייך כשרץ אליו אריה, סימן שהוא לא מבין מה זה אריה. אומרים בעלי המוסר אריה ראשי תיבות אלול, ראש השנה, יום הכיפורים והושענא רבה. רץ לכיוון שלנו. אנחנו כבר התחלנו את הריצה של האריה. אנחנו בשיאו של חודש אלול. אנחנו צריכים להתעורר, לא יכול להיות שאלול נכנס ואנחנו ממשיכים כרגיל. אומרים חכמים אפילו הדגים שבים רועדים. למה דג צריך לפחד?
Great. So did you guys catch that? Somebody telling teenagers, the word, if a lion is running towards you, you have to be scared. Aryeh is Rashi Tevot, it's a mnemonic. The Aleph, the first letter of Aryeh is Elul. The Resh, the second letter of Aryeh is Rosh Hashanah. The Yud, the third letter of Aryeh is Yom Kippur. The Hey, the fourth letter of Aryeh is Hoshana Rabbah. These are the 4 days, the 4 time periods of judgment. You have to be scared. If you're not scared, there's something wrong with you. He's speaking to nominally observant Israeli teenagers. You caught the background in the back, the raging sea, the tone of voice. This is one way of experiencing Chodesh Elul, the month of Elul, and that is what we're going to be discussing today. Here is a second way of experiencing the month of Elul, and this is going to be more the last 2 classes, but let's at least foreshadow a little bit. This is from a shul, or a Karbach shul, that is a couple of meters away from where I'm currently staying. This is the first night of Slichos in the Karbach shul. think you got the point. So that is the way, I actually stopped in slichos there 1 year just to see what the experience is like, or to experience what it's like. And it's very different than anything I've ever experienced before. This is the range that we're talking about, and we're going to be describing some of the, I guess, the philosophical backgrounds and the sources which allow you to experience Elo in method A and method B. And these are both from 2017. Both of these videos were produced less than a month away from each other, both in Israel. Great. So without further ado, let us move on to section 2, which is the medieval approach based on the Rambam and Rabbeinu Yonah to the emotions of tshuva. But before we go on, any comments or questions? Good. So far, so good. Great. So let us, before we get to the emotions of tshuva, let us look at, just technically speaking, what is the process of tshuva? So look at source number 4 on the source on the source sheet. This is the Rambam Hilchos Tshuva, the Rambam the Laws of Tshuva, chapter 2, halacha 2. Mahi hatshuva. This is where the Rambam defines for us what actually is tshuva. It's a very simple process. It seems like these components are slightly debated by other people, but it's basically the same formula if you go through all of the various commentators. If you want to follow in the English, follow in the English. The English is from Chabad.org, which has a free English translation of the entirety of Rambam. Step 1, you have to stop sinning. Good. Remove the sin from your mind. Make a kabbalah, make a decision for the future to no longer sin in the future. Skip down the line. And also, you have to regret the past. So the steps of tshuva are fairly simple. Stop sinning, regret the past, make a commitment for the future to not do it again. The Rambam says at the very end, you have to verbalize all of these elements, and pitom, good, you fulfill the mitzvah of tshuva, you achieved kapara, you achieved atonement. Good. So what we're interested in more in now is the emotional associations with this process. So one halacha later, the Rambam tells us as follows. This is sort of all we get from the Rambam. Rabbeinu Yonah is going to elaborate on this a lot more. Source number 5. Midarchei hatshuva. What is the path of tshuva? Again, Rabbi Soloveitchik calls this signon. This is like the path. This is the way you're supposed to experience the process. Lios hashav tzoek tamid l'fnei Hashem. The person doing tshuva has to constantly cry out to God. Bevechi, with tears, v'tachanunim, pleading. V'osek tzedakah kifikalkot, and give tzedakah, give as much charity as possible. Misrapik harbe ben hadavar, and to distance yourself entirely from this item with which you sin. So the Rambam doesn't give us so much, but what does he give us? You have to scream, pray to God. Bechi and tachanunim, there's a certain element of sadness that comes along with the regret over what you did in the past. Again, it could be somewhat intuitive. We're going to see people moving away from this, but the Rambam just gives us a certain sense of sadness and regret that we have when we think about our past mistakes. If you turn to the next page, we're going to be focusing for the next couple of minutes on Rabbeinu Yonah. Rabbeinu Yonah was a Spanish Rishon living in the 1300s. He was both a halachicist, a community leader, and an early named Kabbalist. But he's most famous for this book, Sha'arei Tshuva, Gates of Repentance, which originally was part of a longer work, most of which was lost. But Sha'arei Tshuva was copied over in the next generation. It's already referenced by his students as a seminal work that should be studied day in, day out. And over the course of time, it sort of won its place in the Jewish canon, and it is something that is studied very widely in yeshivot and midrashot, even to today, during the month of El. So in the first part of Sha'arei Tshuva, Rabbeinu Yonah describes the same steps as the Rambam. You have to stop doing your sin, you have to express regret, you have to make a commitment for the future. Then he goes through Ikarei HaTshuva, some of the main principles of tshuva. Here are some of the main principles of tshuva. So now, source number 6, Hayagon. What's yagon? Misery, grief. That's a word used by the rabbis, the Chazal, when they're describing mourning. They're describing the way you feel when a close relative passes away. Yishonein kilyotav v'yachshov. A person should, your conscience should darken. You should think, Kama Rabba Ra'as Mishem Ras Yotzer. How bad am I that I rebelled against God? V'yavdil Yagon Bilbavo. And it's not enough to experience this once. You have to sit there and think and contemplate in order to elicit the emotion of yagon, of misery, of grief, and intensify it as much as possible within your heart. And a storm has to start churning in your mind. And you have to sigh out of complete bitterness. He goes on to explain, because if you just say, I'm sorry that I did it, it's not going to be enough. He says that if you lose $1, if you lose a small coin, you express some regret. If you lose $1 million, you express a lot more regret. If you sin against God, that is all the more so on the scale of $1 million, you have to feel like your entire life has gone to waste. Similar to somebody that lost a very, very precious treasure. Skip down to Os Yud Gimel, to the last line of source number 6. He writes as follows: Umadrigos hatshuva uma'aloseha. The levels of tshuva and how accomplished, how elevated your tshuva is, lefi godel hamriros ve'otzem hayagim. It's based on how much you feel this misery, this grief. How do you know if you are accomplished a positive tshuva, a positive sense that it did what it was supposed to do, that you're cleansed before God? If you feel misery, grief, mourning, like you're worthless, then you know that you're cleansed. If you think this is bad, or this is bad, if you think this is a full description, he goes on for pages about similar associative types of emotions that are connected with yagon. Look at source number 7. Source number 7 is 2 lines later in Shari Tshuva. He writes as follows: Os Tezvav, another principle of Tshuva, Hatsa'ar b'ma'aseh. You have to feel distress over what you did. What does it mean to feel distress over what you did? He goes on to explain. Kama, he quotes a pasuk. Skip down to the second line. Halev v'ha'enayim shnei sarsurei hachet. The eyes and the heart are the 2 intermediaries. They're 2 channels through which we sin. Why? Because he quotes a medrash that says your eyes see something, your heart covets it, and then you go ahead and do it. But the intermediaries between your brain and the actual action are the eyes seeing it and your heart coveting that action or that item. So if you're talking about tsar b'masa, you have to feel distress over what you did. That means these faculties of the human being, these faculties, these limbs of the human being have to feel distress. What does it mean for the eyes to feel distress? You have to cry. The eyes crying is a kapara. It atones. It's the distress which cleanses the eyes from taking part in that process of sin. What does it mean for the heart to feel distress? He quotes the pasuk, Leiv nishbar v'nivkeh. A broken heart, God is not going to reject. You have to feel broken on the inside. You have to feel worthless. Another thing, I should have put this in the sheet. Another thing he talks about is shiftless. Shiftless literally means degradation. You have to feel degraded by sin. You have to feel like you're worthless. He says you have to go around the street looking at other people and thinking that person is better than me. It doesn't matter if that person is like tripping an old lady as she's crossing the street, but at the same time they're stealing candy from a baby. It doesn't matter. You sinned, you have to feel shiftless, you have to feel degraded, you have to feel like you are lower than other people. In the end of this piece, in source number 7, he quotes a halachic analogy. He says that if you have a kli cheres, you have an earthenware vessel that is mekabel tumah, that is contaminated through contact with a corpse or with some other contaminating force, there is no way for that earthenware vessel, for that china, to become pure unless it is broken. The breaking of a vessel is what purifies it. Similarly, about the human personality, and particularly about the limbs that cause a person to sin, what do you have to do to cleanse yourself, to purify yourself? You have to break yourself. I think, I was raised that you have to channel. You have these positive parts of yourself, you have to channel them in the right way. You have to make sure that they're not being used for bad, they're being used for good. We're not talking about channeling. We're not talking about changing your orientation. We're talking about taking your personality and breaking it, feeling like you're worthless, and then rebuilding yourself up from those ashes. So we have yago, we have misery, we have tsar b'ma'asa, we have distress in the action, distress in the limbs that caused the sin. Right? If you're following the source sheet and source number 4, you have this person carrying the big ball of guilt. Between sources 7 and 8, that for me was the imagery of what Rabbeinu Yonah is trying to depict. Source number 8, skipping down a couple of pages in Rabbeinu Yonah in Shari Tshuva, we move forward from feeling broken on the inside to da'aga. Da'aga literally means worry, or the more modern term for it is anxiety. My wife is a psychologist, and she practices here in Israel in Hebrew. I should have mentioned that I'm based in Ramat Beit Shemesh. Thank God I'm married to Dr. Bronstein, a great person, and 4 beautiful kids. I feel much more like a parent and a spouse during this Corona period than a teacher. So I'm sorry if the teaching is coming off rough. But no, da'aga is a word that's used as a technical psychological term in Israel for anxiety. And that it's not a newfangled meaning of the word da'aga. That is what the word da'aga means in Rabbinic Hebrew. For Rabbeinu Yonah, an ikar of tshuva, a principle of tshuva, is feeling da'aga, is feeling anxiety, feeling worry. Why? He says there are 3 different things you have to feel anxiety over. Number 1 is punishment. If you sin, the Torah says you will get punished in this world or the world to come. You have to be scared about that. You have to worry about that, and therefore fix yourself. Second paragraph. Another thing to have anxiety about is maybe, even though you're doing tshuva, even though you feel yago, you feel misery, you feel grief, you feel distress, it's not enough. You're not doing enough. You have to feel anxiety that maybe even though I'm doing tshuva, I'm not doing enough tshuva. That this is a type of mindset, which I think my wife would say is, again, if taken to the extreme, is something which is diagnosable. You're doing something, you're doing the process, you're doing it correctly, but you're always concerned, maybe I'm not doing it enough, maybe I'm not doing it correctly. So the first thing you have to have anxiety over is the fear of punishment. Second thing you have to have anxiety over is maybe you're not doing tshuva properly. Number 3, Os Yud Zayin, the last paragraph over here, V'od Yidag, another thing to have anxiety over, Baal tshuva, somebody who is in the process of doing tshuva, Pen Yizgaver Alav Yitzro. Maybe your Yetzer Hara, maybe your evil inclination will get the better of you the next time. Because if you failed once, maybe you're going to fail again. And he says this is not just something which you should think about once over the course of your day, or once over the course of the process of tshuva. These things have to weigh down on you. They have to bear on you. You have to be thinking about it constantly during the process of tshuva. Maybe I'm not doing enough. Maybe God's going to punish me. Maybe if I'm put in the same situation, I'm not going to withstand the test. And all of those things are part of the process of tshuva. Again, if this was in person and people were my students in a regular classroom, I would stop here and ask for whether or not anybody was taught this as a proper approach to tshuva in their Jewish day schools or equivalent thereof. I know myself that I didn't realize how much my education is a product of 20th century Jewish thought until I started reading medieval Jewish thought. And you see what the continuities are, but you also see what the ruptures are, and you see what messages are very clearly in the Rishonim, and what messages over the course of time sort of got reoriented and skewed, like Rav Soloveitchik said, because there's a different signon ha'chayim today, it's a different mentality, a different mindset, a different way we experience life, and therefore we're not creating yesh me'ayin, not creating a new process of tshuva, but many of us are going to experience it differently because of the people that we are and because of the generation that we live in. And that's something we're going to be highlighting from Rav Soloveitchik, Rav Kook, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe as we go on. Good. So we just described some of the associative emotions of the process of tshuva. For Rabbeinu Yonah, you have yago, you have misery, you have distress, you have shiftless, degradation, you have anxiety. And that's all in the first part of the book, Sha'ar Tshuva, Sha'ar Aleph, the first gate, where he describes the Ikar Tshuva, the principles of tshuva. The Sha'ar Beis, the second gate of tshuva, second gate of the book, he describes the motivating factors for tshuva. Granted, this is the process I'm supposed to go through. what motivates me to go through that process? So he mentioned 6 different motivating factors. But what is the C? What is the P? What is the last motivating factor that's supposed to be in everybody's mind constantly as they do tshuva? Look at source number 9. If you have the sheet in front of you. He calls it Zechiras Yom HaMavas, remembering the day of death. Kol eis yikon likras avokav. At every moment, you should prepare yourself to meet your Creator. Ki lo yeda ha'adam es ito. A person doesn't know their own time. Akein kil yosav yishtonein. Therefore, your innards have to be darkened. U'b'tzedakah yochonein. You have to prepare yourself with righteousness. L'hashiv rucho b'tara. To return your soul to your Creator with purity. El Elokeim asher nisana. To the God that gave you your soul. Yichapes tirachav ma'alav b'chol yom. And every day you have to think about this. Maybe today is my last day. And therefore, I have an obligation to repent and cleanse myself and purify myself and go through that process he described in the first gate in Shara Aleph today. If you look at the last paragraph, I'm not going to read it inside, he says this is not something which you only do on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. This has to be tamid, it has to be constant. You have to be constantly reminding yourself that life here is transient, life here is temporary. Unfortunately, we've all had crazy amounts of reminders in the last couple of months, if that's true, but most of us do, up until COVID, most of us didn't, I can't speak for most of us, I don't really know the people here, I know for myself, did not live with this consciousness that life is transient. I'm still relatively young, I'm 35 years old, my kids are pretty young, they keep me busy. I don't have so much time to contemplate and meditate about the meaning of life. And yeah, I can honestly say I have not fulfilled this mandate of Rabbeinu Yonah to remember the day of death every day. If I did, during Corona time, when unfortunately people I know did pass away, and unfortunately there was a lot of thoughts about mortality, it's very paralyzing for me. It's very paralyzing. You can't make plans for the future. I want to finish this project. I want to see my kids do X, Y, and Z. I want to experience X, Y, and Z with my spouse. Because every day you're thinking about, there's no reason to plan for the future and make long-term plans and enjoy reaching those plans if every day you're just be besat with anxiety that maybe today is going to be my last day and you're thinking about transience of life and mortality. I'm sorry that I should have given a trigger warning for this class, that this is going to be the heavy class, and as we go on, we'll move away from the heaviness and move more to the Krabach again in varying stages. But for Rabbeinu Yonah, this is a very powerful, very, very powerful motivating factor to go through the tshuva process, as difficult as the tshuva process is. So good. So you have a whole slew of emotions that we would describe maybe as negative, as heavy, and a motivating factor also is something which is extremely heavy, and extremely, extremely scary and dreadful. So that is section 2 of this presentation. Just going through, again, I'm dramatizing it a little bit. There's a lot more in Sha'arei Tshuva other than these highlights, but this is trying to create an emotional picture based on some of the things he describes. I remember when I was 18 years old and I was in yeshiva, and I was told what people are supposed to do is they learn Sha'arei Tshuva in the month of Elul. I learned Sha'arei Tshuva in the month of Elul, and I could tell you, half of me was scared of my wits, and half of me just thought, I don't half believe this, don't really want to do this. There was like a lot of cognitive dissonance before I was introduced to the wider breadth of Jewish thought. But let's assume you're taking this approach. You're taking the Rabbeinu Yonah approach, and you want to apply it practically. You want to experience Elul with these feelings. What is your Elul going to look like, and how are you supposed to get there? So before I move on to the next section, to looking at some of the people from the more recent mussar movement, picking up on these themes. Does anybody have any comments, critiques, or questions before we move on? Daniel, please.
Hi. So I'm curious how notions of teshuva changed varied between Ashkenazi and Sephardi poskim based on their surrounding communities, kind of with Muslim notions of repentance versus kind of more Christian notions of repentance.
That is a great question. If I recall correctly, it's either Yisrael Tashma or Ephraim Kannerfogel who both write on the time period of the Rishonim, point out that I didn't quote any of it here, but the heaviest passages you'll find about tshuva and what you have to do to achieve atonement are among the Hasidei Ashkenaz, the pietists in Germany in the 1100s, who they were the ones that advocated that members of their group should literally roll in the snow to cause bodily pain to the limb that committed the sin in order to achieve atonement. So it's not just emotional distress, it's actually putting yourself in physical distress. And you'll find that almost everybody, Mesilas Yesharim, an ultimate mussar book that people study today, says in the first chapter, do not think you have to roll in the snow to achieve the heights in the service of God, to elevate yourself. He's referring to a real group of people that did that in order to achieve these heights. So to be honest, I do not know 100%. My fields are basically Chazal, Midrash Halacha, and 20th century Jewish philosophy. Everything in between is a little bit easy for me. But I do know that in terms of the heaviness of tshuva, the Hasidei Ashkenaz, what's the point of this? They're very heavily influenced by the Christian surroundings who are also into these types of heavy forms of repentance in Germany in the 1100s during that time period. I cannot speak for people in Sephardi lands, but in Muslim lands. But I do know that they highlight Hasidei Ashkenaz as the heaviest you get within the Jewish tradition. And we're not going to see it inside. Rabbi Soloveitchik himself rejects the Hasidei Ashkenaz on several other passages about several other issues relating to this in terms of asceticism, in terms of not gaining pleasure from the beauty of this world. But thank you, Daniel, for the question. And if you have anything else to say about it, please feel free to chime in. Good. 1800s, we're not talking about Egypt and Gerona and Spain. We're talking about Eastern Europe. Yisrael Salanter, he was not from Salant. He was from a lesser-known city in Lithuania that's name I'm forgetting now. But he studied under Rav Zudel of Salant, and therefore he became known as Yisrael of Salant. And he is the founder of the modern mussar movement. What does that mean? That means he went around Europe to the various yeshivot that were there and to the various people studying Gemara and told them it is not enough to study Gemara, not enough to study Jewish law, not enough to study Chumash, not enough to study Rashi. You have to study mussar, ethical teachings, and actively work on yourself. Understand your unconscious, do behavioral activism. He has all these pre-Freudian things. He has a whole essay, what he calls the machshava pnimi versus machshava chitzoni, which basically means the conscious and subconscious thought. And he talks about you have to realize your subconscious negios, your subconscious biases about yourself before you can actually work on yourself and fix yourself. Very, very rigid, very, very methodical, very, very ethically based. Or Yisrael is a series of letters he sent out to various people about mussar, about studying mussar. In letter 14, Or Yisrael, you have one of the most famous statements about the month of Elul in Haredi yeshivos today. This is quoted all over the place, as we'll see. But Rav Salanter says as follows, and he's writing this in the mid-1800s. He says, Milafanim kasher yadati, source number 10. Earlier, when I knew, he says, when I was a young person, he studied in Salant in the 1820s. Kol ish achazot palatzot. Everybody was beset with terror. Mikol hakorei kadosh Elul. Now people called out Elul. This trepidation, this fear, bore fruits. To draw people close to the service of God. What's he saying? That when they announced the month of Elul was approaching in shuls, in yeshivot, people would tremble. People would tremor. He says he saw this himself. And he says, but in my generation, I don't see it as much. He's writing now as an older person. He says, you read Sadoros, there's a descent of the generations. People today don't feel Elul as much. And therefore, he says, what, practically speaking, do you have to do to achieve these emotions that Rabbeinu Yonah described, the fear, the anxiety, the heaviness of Elul? It's a month like any other month. It's during August, and we're still on vacation, many of us, et cetera, et cetera. What do we have to do to feel the heaviness of Elul? Yisrael Salanter is extremely, extremely consistent in his approach to life. Study mussar methodically. Read Rabbeinu Yonah. Read Mesilat Yesharim. Read other books that describe your obligation, describe the way you're supposed to feel. And he has a whole method in how you're supposed to read them. supposed to read them bespilus. You're supposed to read them al shakule, with your eyes closed, repeating a line over and over again, each time elevating your voice higher and higher, so until the end of the day you're screaming. And by doing these things, you will convince yourself, you will enter the mindset of Elul. But he says, if you don't study mussar, you don't read Rabbeinu Yonah, you don't read these books that describe what you're supposed to feel during Elul, there's no chance you're going to actually tap in to the improper emotional state we're all supposed to be feeling right now on Gimel Elul, on the third day of Elul. So practically speaking, for Yisrael Salanter, what does this mean? What is the entryway to experiencing Elul like Rabbeinu Yonah? Every day, a half an hour, he doesn't give a time, study mussar the way he describes, you will eventually enter that emotional mindset, that emotional space. But that's not enough. Let's say every day, I'm sitting on my beautiful merpeset in Israel, looking at the beautiful mountains. I'm having my kids play in the sprinkler in my merpeset that we just bought for 10 shekel, which broke today. And the scene around me is beautiful. And the kids are playing in the park, and the birds are chirping, and everything is serene and beautiful. And I'm studying Shara Tshuva, I'm studying Rabbeinu Yonah, and I'm reading about how I have to feel fear and anxiety and how horrible of a person I am. There's a disconnect between what I'm reading and what I'm trying to get myself to believe and feel and experience, and the environment that I'm in. And therefore, what did the next generation of Bali Mussar say? What do you have to do during Elul in order to properly experience Elul? Stay in a closed environment. If you're in a yeshiva or a midrasha, meaning there are Bali Mussar talking about yeshivot, we're going to be looking at the Chaskel Levenstein, stay in yeshiva. Don't go out to the street. Go out to the street as little as possible. Because the street is not experiencing Elul. The street is experiencing whatever the street normally experiences. People are happy. People are happy-go-lucky. People are going about their business. People are shopping. People are going on recreation. People are going on vacations. You're not going to enter the space of Elul if you're living in that environment. You have to stay in a closed environment in the yeshiva, and then by learning mussar and by staying with the people that are invested in experiencing this together with you, you will be able to experience Elul properly, experience the process of tshuva properly. Look at source number 11 on the next page. Rabbi Levenstein. Kaspar Levenstein was not a student of Yisrael Salanter, a student of Yisrael Salanter, but he was a major figure of the mussar movement, one of these bridge figures. He was the mashgiach, basically the head of mussar in the Mir Yeshiva in Europe pre-World War II. He was the mashgiach in Shanghai. When the Mir Yeshiva fled to Shanghai, he was the person, one of the people that kept people together. They published his sermons, his discourses from that time period. It's chilling to read them. What he was telling the yeshiva guys when they're in Shanghai in the middle of World War II. After the war, he actually immigrated to America for 2 years, eventually made his way to Israel, and eventually made his way to Panovich, where he became one of the main mashgiach in Panovich in Bnei Brak, where Rav Shach was a yeshiva, and he was a mashgiach. And he basically was one of the founders of the mussar movement in the Haredi world in the modern state of Israel. See, they publish his discourses, his sermons, in 6 volumes called Or Yecheskel. So Chilek Beis, the second volume, talks about Elul v'Yom Narayim, Elul and the days of awe in Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. He quotes the story of Yisrael Salanter. Then in Yisrael Salanter's days, in the early 1800s, everybody was scared when they announced Elul. You look at the first line, source number 11, the middle of the line. I wasn't able to cut the line in the middle. He says he himself experienced something similar. He says, Gamani b'zachruni. I also remember, from the days of my youth. He was born in 1868, 1870. So I have the year somewhere. He was born in 1885. 1885. He says, I remember from the days of my youth in the 1890s. When I learned in Yeshiva in Lumja, which was a mussar yeshiva in Poland. The young boys, myself included, would gather together before the evening prayers, the Mosai Shabbos Kodesh, at the end of the week, in the dark room. Rav David Tevel, Mitalmide, going to Yisrael Salanter, David Tevel, another figure in the mussar movement, would talk words of arousement. We would all say together, Hashivenu Avinu Sarasecha, God bring us back, allow us to repent. V'kulam hayu partzim bevechi. This is what Rabbi Soloveitchik had in mind. You need a group of people doing it together, learning mussar together. Otherwise, you're not going to enter that emotional space. He goes on to say, what does this mean for me? Now that I'm sort of, he's not saying I'm in charge of a yeshiva, but now that he's in the point of leadership, what is he advising the young Bachrim, the young yeshiva students in Panovich and Bnei Brak in the 1960s? Look at the after the ellipsis. It says, "Man na'aneh anan." What are we going to say? Shebizmanenu, in our time, she'rak asher yotzim l'rechova sha'ir. If you walk into the street, miyad mitpashetet hakrivut b'nafshenu. A coldness towards Elul, a coldness towards tshuva spreads within our hearts. What street was he talking about? He's talking about the streets of Bnei Brak. Has anybody here ever walked the streets of Bnei Brak? It's not, 1970s was different than it is today. The streets of Bnei Brak are among, the holiest. It's hard for me to measure these things, but the streets of Bnei Brak are very different than the streets of Manhattan. Bnei Brak is a Haredi city. You're not going to be hearing secular music blasting. Everybody's going to be the highest levels of tznius, whatever that means, for better or for worse. You're not like walking into a secular metropolis. You're walking into Bnei Brak. And the moment you walk out of the yeshiva into the streets of Bnei Brak, a coldness towards Mandat Elul, towards tshuva, spreads within your heart. He himself says, when I walked from my house to the yeshiva, I heard people singing. Look at the last line of this paragraph. Right before I entered the yeshiva, I walked from my home in Bnei Brak to the yeshiva, Shamati kol zimra. I heard people singing, people humming to themselves. It caused a coldness in me. I cannot serve God the same way as I did before. So practically speaking, what are the practical expressions of this Rabbeinu Yonah approach to tshuva, this happiness approach to tshuva? Number one, you have to learn mussar. Number two, you have to closet yourself with people, like-minded people. Otherwise, it is not going to work. And now, just today in Israel, if you follow the Haredi news, they're talking about a mashber, a crisis among yeshiva students, because the yeshivos can't have the amount of people they used to have. There are hundreds of Haredi yeshiva students that are home, that aren't in the yeshivos. They're home in Haredi communities, but it's still a mashber, it's still a crisis, because you can't spend Elul in the yeshiva, and the Haredi media is talking about this, playing it up. Parents are talking about it, kids are talking about it, the mashkikim, the rabbeim, the rabbis, the teachers are talking about it. How could we have Elul without yeshiva bachrim in the yeshiva? How is it going to influence them, impact them how is that going to negatively impact them going forward? Good. So that's the end of part 3. Just taking this approach of Rabbeinu Yonah and seeing how it plays itself out a little bit in a more contemporary setting with practical expressions, with practical directives. The picture at the top of page 8 is a picture of the yeshiva of Lumja that was mentioned before in Petach Tikva. The yeshivas Lumja, Poland, opened up a branch in Israel in the 1920s, and it is still there in Petach Tikva until today. You could go visit. It is still called itself Yeshiva Lumja in Petach Tikva. It is considered a major yeshiva here in Israel. Good. Any comments or questions before we go on to the last section in the last 10 minutes? Great. So the question is, again, we're going to see other approaches, 20th century approaches. The question is, if you're taking this approach, if you're taking the approach of Rabbeinu Yonah and you're applying it practically, where's the joy? Where's the happiness? And if you want to ask the question more broadly, it's how psychologically healthy is this approach? I'm not going to answer the question. I'm not even we're not going to explore it right here, right now. It's not for me to judge. Right here, I'm just here to give different approaches. I'm not going to say which one is better or worse. But happiness and joy are certainly values in Judaism, certainly values in mental health. So is there happiness and joy in this process of tshuva as described by Rabbeinu Yonah and continued by the Baalei Mussar? So the answer is yes and no. There are 2 parts to the answer. The first part of the answer is that there is joy. But where does Rabbeinu Yonah, where does the Rambam describe joy? Not during the process, but at the end of the process. Aaron Lichtenstein, in an essay, The Joy of Tshuva, which I read only after preparing the source sheet, which I was very happy because it follows a very similar line, points this out, that if you go through Rabbeinu Yonah, you go through the Rambam, and the word simcha, joy, usher, happiness, are found only at the end of the process. When you leave shul after Ne'ilah and Yom Kippur, and you feel cleansed, you did it, you made it through the process, you feel like you're at the top of the world, you feel close to God, that is where the joy is. But during Elul, during this time period now, during Rosh Hashanah, during Aseret Meshuvah, during Yom Kippur, forget about it. There's no joy. Simcha is not described there. Happiness is not described. Serenity is not described. Those things occur at the end of the process when you are successful after going through all of these things. So that's answer number one. Answer number two, which is something which again, if you want to, we're not going to go through it now, but the Rambam, source number 12, I gave you the Rambam Parak Zayin, chapter 7, where it describes the results of tshuva. And the results of tshuva are very uplifting, very inspiring, very happifying. He uses the word simcha. The word happifying is not a word, but I like using it anyway. He uses the word simcha in here. He uses the word how amazing tshuva is, what the effect it has on the person. You would think it's like a happy-go-lucky process, but he only describes this as the result of the process, not as accompanying the process itself. But there's a broader point here. And if you look at source number 13, brings us into the broader point. We only have like 5 minutes to go through it. I didn't mean to go through it in its entirety, but it's something which I think is interesting to think about. And that is, I'm an American. I was raised on the Declaration of Independence, that all human beings are endowed with a right of pursuit of happiness. We live in a world, and we have lived in a world for the last 200 years or so, that human beings in the Western world are born and are raised with an expectation to achieve happiness. What does happiness mean? Feeling of contentness, a feeling of serenity. The people, the scholars, Jewish scholars in Jewish tradition, scholars of other religious traditions, historians who study this, basically point out, as a unified voice, that this is a relatively modern assumption. The fact that human beings expect that they should achieve serenity, joy, feel good about themselves in this world, as they're living their lives, day-to-day drudgery, was not assumed in pre-modern times. You look at source in the Jewish context, Dr. Chava Tiro Samuelson, she's a professor of Jewish studies at the University of Arizona, has a book, Happiness in Pre-Modern Judaism, Virtue, Knowledge, and Well-Being. She is not describing who achieves happiness, but what is the definition of happiness in the Bible, what is the definition of happiness in rabbinic literature, and she goes through it as a definition of happiness in the Rambam, and then she compares that to the Islamic world and the Christian world. So I felt silly putting page 2 on the source sheet, because put page 2 in the source sheet, it sounds like I didn't actually read the book. I'll be honest, I only read the first half of the book, which deals with rabbinic times. I did not read into the Rambam and medieval times, because I read this book as part of my my doctoral research, and I only had to know rabbinic time period, and anything that wasn't necessary, unfortunately, I didn't have time to explore. But this is a succinct summary of her thesis as it applies to the rabbinic time period. She says, properly understood, I contend that in Judaism, happiness does not mean possessing material goods, having fun, feeling content, or enjoying physical pleasures, although some of these elements may be part of a happy life. Happiness is not a subjective feeling manifested in a given moment or for a short period of time. Instead, it means flourishing, thriving, experiencing a well-being appropriate to human beings. It's an objective state of affairs. It's an objective state of affairs that if you follow the path of Torah, you study Torah, follow the path of Torah, that is a definition of happiness, because you're doing the best, the ultimate, the peak of what a human being is able to do. Will you feel subjective happiness? Some moments yes, some moments not. But the goal is not this feeling of contentment that we modern people associate with happiness. That's not the goal. The goal is to live maximally. The goal is to live optimally. And that is what Chazal mean when they describe Ashrei, feeling of Osher, feeling of Simcha. And she goes through this proof by proof by proof. In Halacha, one of the ultimate joyful acts, one of the ultimate acts of Simcha, of joy, is the study of Torah. A mourner, somebody who is an Avela, somebody who a relative passed away, cannot study Torah. Does studying Torah give me joy the same way playing with a 2-year-old child gives me joy? Absolutely not. It's a very different experience. But from a halachic perspective, studying Torah is an act of simcha, an act of joy, while playing with a child perhaps is a distraction from that thing which I should be doing, which is studying Torah. So if you're coming in with this assumption that who says you're supposed to be feeling content or serene and joyful in your life day to day? It's part of it. Simchas Yom Tov, simply you experience on a festival, on a holiday, does have some of the modern connotations of joy. She goes through it. But the ultimate goal isn't content serenity on the inside, subjectively. It's following a path that is going to create the ultimate flourishing of the human being. For Aristotle, it was his set of things, and for the rabbis, for Chazal, it was their set of things. And therefore, if you look at source number 14, there's this guy, Dr. Darren McMullen, he teaches at Dartmouth College. He had wrote a book, The History of Happiness. So this is not from his book, The History of Happiness. This is from a short article he wrote. The article is entitled, For Most of History, People Didn't Assume They Deserved to Be Happy. What changed? He describes Aristotle's approach to happiness, which is living with a certain set of truths. And he says, this lifestyle wasn't supposed to be easy. The ranks of the content, as Aristotle observed, would ever be the happy few. Was the content, meaning the happy people, are those people that are living life optimally. I mean, those people that actually understand the nature of the world, according to Aristotle, and live life accordingly. How many people do that? They're going to be the happy few. But for those rare people who would commit themselves to the discipline of the regime, the promise of a flourishing life was great. The mere search for higher happiness, Cicero observed, not merely its actual attainment, as a prize beyond all human wealth or honor or physical pleasure. True happiness, in short, had to be earned. We're not talking about subjective feelings of contentment, of serenity, what we associate with happiness. We're talking about living optimally. And therefore, for the Rishonim, this may not have even been a major question. You're going to feel bad about yourself. You're not going to feel happy or joyful or walk with the bounce in your step if you approach tshuva the way Rabbi Yonah describes. Who says you're supposed to? You're supposed to live life optimally. We're not going to read it inside. You can read it yourself. Source number 415, Rabbi Yaakov of Lisa. He was a rabbi of Lisa in the 1800s. He is the author of Nesivos HaMishpat, the Chavos Da'as. He made it onto the page of Shulchan Aruch. If you open up a standard volume of Shulchan Aruch, he's one of the major commentaries there. He wrote an ethical will to his children, which is called Derech Chaim. During his time period, the Hasidic movement was already all over the place. He wrote to them. Let's read the first two lines. My beloved children, keep yourselves at great distance from joy and scope. For how can a person be happy? As every day we wake up and say, the Hasidim are telling you, mitzvah gadol yos b'simcha, always be happy. That is not the Jewish way. The Jewish way is not always to be happy. If you're involved in a mitzvah, feel privileged to be involved in a mitzvah, be happy. If you wake up in the morning and you're eating breakfast, what's there to be happy about? What's there to feel content and serene about? I think this is not the only approach, but this is a approach from medieval Jewish philosophy all the way down as hopefully we've seen. We're not going to go through it inside again, but source number 16, I just wanted to put this in the source sheet because I think it's fascinating for people who want to read it. The Journal of Law and Religion, it was put out by Cambridge University Press, it's put out by Harvard, and in February 2014, they had a symposium on happiness in different religions. They had Jonathan Sachs write about happiness from Judaism. They had the Dalai Lama write about happiness from a Buddhist perspective. They had Christians and Muslims whose names I don't recognize write about happiness from a Christian and Muslim perspective. And it's really it's very readable. It's not heavily jargonized in academic language, but it's very, very readable. Rabbi Sachs, I think, has a brilliant essay where he writes as follows. Again, just read through it. Happiness, though, is not central to the Judaic value system. The telos of human activity, Judaism, is the pursuit of holiness, not the pursuit of happiness. Happiness might be the result. It might be there. It's associated with this type of lifestyle at times, but it's not the game. He says, why is happiness not the be-all and end-all in Judaism? Because if you're happy, he says, you are content, you're serene, you're going to end up being passive. Judaism was born out of protest. Judaism was born out of Avram Avinu looking at the world and saying, God, you created a world in a certain way, but it's not perfect. We have to perfect the world. We have to be attacking the world to fix the world. We have to make the world better. If you live life in a state of constant happiness, a constant joy, likelihood is you're going to have a very passive approach to social problems, to personal problems, and things of that sort, because you're content with things the way they are. Now, for Rabbi Sachs, that's why Judaism has happiness as a category. It is a halachically significant category, as he goes on to describe, but it is not the be-all and end-all of Judaism. And I think that manifests itself in one way, shape, or form in this approach to tshuva that we've been describing from Rabbeinu Yonah down through the Ephesus, down through the Bali Mussar. So God willing, next Sunday, we will start our survey, the 20th century great figures. Again, I'll describe why I'm focusing on Rav Soloveitchik, Rav Kook, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe out of other possible figures. I think next week we'll look at Rabbi Soloveitchik, who's the closest to this, but starts moving away, and we'll see what perhaps 20th century factors started moving him away from this model. It's at 9:01. I don't want to keep anybody here more than I have to, but if anybody has any comments or questions, I'm more than happy to stay on the line afterwards for as long as it takes. But if anybody wants to leave, definitely feel free, and I apologize for going 1 minute over time. And thank you so much. I really appreciate being able to come together, and I really appreciate us being able to think about El and Shuvah together in this way. Yeah, Daniel, please.
I'm curious what Jonathan Sachs would say about the Akedah in this case.
That is a great question. He actually has a very interesting read about the Akedah in general. I don't know if it's Pshat or it's apologetics, but his approach to the Akedah, which he is based on one line of Cook's commentary to a Siddur, is that the whole point of the Akedah was to set up a false conflict to make a dramatic point for people in future generations that this type of conflict is never going to happen again. That's Rav Kook has one line where he says that. Rabbi Sachs plays it up. If you want to see it, he has it in his parsha sheets, his conversations. But also he has a debate with Richard Dawkins that was sponsored by the BBC, and back when when Richard Dawkins' book, what's it called, The God's Illusion. Richard Dawkins is an evolutionary biologist who wrote a book about atheism in the early 21st century, and he and Rabbi Sachs had a public debate sponsored by the BBC, and they debated the Akedah, and Rabbi Sachs goes at length in that debate. You find it on YouTube about this approach to the Akedah. So we're going to see Rabbi Soloveitchik is actually going to play up the Akedah as the ultimate point of conflict, where God wants you to experience this tension and this suffering, and we'll see that next week. But thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Rabbi Bronstein. This was, well, you definitely gave me a lot of food for thought. Everyone, thank you for joining us again for the second of our 9 series for Elul, and we hope you'll be joining us again, same time, same place next week for part 2 with Rabbi Bronstein. If you're able to join us again Sunday morning for Rabbi Silver, and tomorrow we also have a class in the evening. Can we change our character perspective from the Bavli to the mussar movement? So a little bit more philosophy coming your way. 8 p.m. tomorrow with Sarah Zager. If you have not yet registered, you still can. Go to www.drisha.org and then /classes. Click on the class that you want. If you don't see a register button, just make sure to follow the links to the Zoom and you can sign up directly there. Thank you again. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone, and be well.